welcome everybody to our last Hungry for History for February. We had the double hitter this month, which was really exciting. So before we get started with today's presentation, I have a couple of announcements. And if you don't know me, I'm LaShawn Sprague with the Municipal Archives. So we don't have an audio system in this room, so I've asked Dr. Pirok to project, and I'm glad you all on your own sat up front, and our door locks. So there is some background noise. I'll prop that open, but we may have some people that come in a little bit late. I'm going to ask you all, if you haven't already, to please mute or turn off your cell phones. Wanted to let you know what's coming up for March. On Monday, March 31st at 3:30, will be the program will be on the Municipal Slavery Research Project. We'll have that here, and I'll send out a program announcement about 2 weeks before that, and I'll be your speaker for that program. So I want to introduce you to our speaker for today. Dr. Alena Pirok is an associate professor of history at Georgia Southern University, where her teaching and research interests include public history, historical memory, 20th century U.S. history, museum history, and prison history. She serves on the Environmental Sustainability Committee and is co-chair of the Labor Task Force, both for the National Council on Public History. She is the author of The Spirit of Colonial Williamsburg, Ghosts and Interpreting the Recreated Past, which was published by the University of Massachusetts Press. Her work has been published in The Public Historian, the Florida Historical Quarterly, Southern Cultures, and Critical Theories in Dark Tourism. This talk is based on her research recently completed for her chapter in the book, Branching Out, The Public History of Trees, which is now also out from the University of Massachusetts Press. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Alena Pirok.
Thank you. Thank you. So this research is a part of my work that I did for Branching Out, but there's a lot of the things that just didn't fit in the chapter, which is a lot of specific Savannah history that I really enjoyed learning about that just wouldn't fit into the thing I was creating. So I'm really happy to be able to share this all with you because I really enjoyed doing the research, looking at Savannah's trees, both in the Municipal Archives, and there's also a collection from the Savannah Tree Foundation that's now in Athens. So I was able to do that. And so this is sort of a product of that. All right. So nearly every promotional photo of Savannah includes trees of some kind. And this is due in large part to the fact that Savannah has trees everywhere, and that the trees in Savannah add to the city's historical landscape. The trees themselves make the city, in addition to the architecture and the unique layout of the downtown, they make the city look like the past. Because the trees that are maintained have this kind of pre-automotive urban landscape. In most American cities, with the emergence of the car, we saw the destruction of most of these trees, whereas Savannah maintains them. So as you walk around the downtown, and as you drive very carefully around the downtown, you're driving in a landscape covered in trees that is distinctly historic, right? So despite there being an urban forest with many, many trees inside of Savannah, there's really only one tree that we think of when we think of a tree in Savannah, and that's the Candler Oak. So this nearly 300-year-old tree is special. It sits in a fenced-off plot in the parking lot of the old Candler Hospital. It has sprawling, thick limbs that reach out and down and nearly overtake the little fence that contains its easement. It's the only tree behind a little fence, and it is, because of it, a sight to behold. And like all trees, it suggests silently a history, or like many other things in Savannah, a supernatural story. However, if you go visit the Candler Oak, sorry, for a second there I was like, is that not the Candler Oak? If you go visit the Candler Oak and you look beyond its little fence into its historical signage, you will read a less than sensational tale of what makes this tree special. The Candler Oak's main claim to fame is that in 1984, it became the first singular tree to be protected by a preservation easement, which is just a legal contract that protects a property from alteration, protects it from new construction. Now, these easements are most often applied to lines of trees, waterways, some buildings. It is unique that the Candler Oak is but one tree and has this easement. So when we look at it, and we know this story, I'm still left with this question of why this tree? Why is this tree special? There are other live oaks in the region. There are other live oaks in Savannah. Why is this tree protected? And it's not particularly unique looking if you know what live oaks look like. And we know that historically, humans have made lots of history around trees. We like to use them, right? We've been identifying trees as markers, symbols, and witnesses of specific historical events for nearly 100 years. The survivor tree at the Oklahoma City bombing site is seen as a witness to this major historical event. Whereas there are trees like Helen Keller's tree and Edgar Allan Poe's tree that are simply associated with historical characters, and therefore we associate the tree with the person. There are other trees that were planted to mark spots. Here, a special thing happened. We planted a tree, here it is, right? The Candler oak is none of these. The Candler oak is not associated with a notable historical character. It did not witness a horrible thing. It did not witness really a significantly historical thing. And yet, it is special, right? Now, if we ask scholars like Jared Farmer explain that trees make really good historical symbols, and that's why we tend to use them. They can be recontextualized, so they can have new stories added to them, easier than man-made monuments that usually have a distinctive message to give. So trees, we like them because despite the fact that most of them are pretty hard, they're very flexible in how we understand history and the stories we tell. Plus, as living things, trees have a lifespan just like we do. Though they tend to live a lot longer than we do, we can still romanticize life and death through them. So the trees are very useful historical objects. They're very useful things for us to interpret. So knowing this, knowing that there had to be something, I dug back into the Candler oak metaphorically, and I said, why are you special? I asked the tree, and of course it can't tell me anything. But the fact is, there's nothing traditionally historical about the Candler oak, which I found very surprising because it's Savannah. In fact, when seeking to preserve the Candler oak, the Savannah Tree Foundation claimed no traditional historical relevancy. Rather, they saved it to protect it. And that, of course, might not hit right, but it doesn't mean that the tree isn't significant. In fact, having looked into it, and I'll tell you why, I argue that the protection of the Candler oak granted all of the city's trees a historical identity that they previously didn't have. And this historical identity recognizes the contribution that trees themselves made to building that city, in our city's historical look. And finally, with this, they secured greater protection for the trees that exist and those that need to be planted. So though the Candler oak, no one wrote a great poem underneath the tree and we know that person for this or that reason, in its preservation story, it gave us a history for the trees. So this narrative, however, is not on a sign, and it's not well known. We don't talk too much about the history of trees in Savannah. But in sharing this story, I think we can build sort of a healthy appreciation for what story there is in the trees that we see and walk by every day. So today I'm going to tell you the story about how the Candler oak became preserved, how it became special, and how it is now a part of Savannah's history. And I'm going to fold in a heaping amount of Savannah tree history. What are these trees? How did they get here? What is their story? And it's quite dramatic. In the end, I'm going to talk a lot about the relationship, too, between Savannah's trees and automobiles, because that, in my research, popped up time and time again. Now let's return to our Candler oak, right? The one thing we know about the Candler oak is that it is very, very old. It is incredibly old. Most of the trees today in Savannah are not as old as the Candler oak. In fact, most of them were planted in like the 20s and 30s. They're 20th century trees. But when looking at the Candler oak, dendrochronologists, people who study trees, say that the Candler oak began to grow around 1730, the oldest. This is around the same time that the English colonists began their project of de- and reforestation. At James Oglethorpe's orders, the colonists undertook a project to cut down trees, build houses, fortify towns, and to sow the land. The area's original trees were chopped down and used for building material and for fuel. While new trees, many of them mulberries, planted with the intention of cultivating silkworms, were planted outside of the initial settlement. Now, if dendrochronologists are accurate, the tree that would be the Candler oak was a seed and began to thrive while the mulberries were dying off. So in 1819, at nearly 100 years old, so the Candler Oak's 100 years now, it's big, it's strong. The tree has dug deep roots in a wooded area about a mile from the river, and it soon found itself to be the neighbor of the newly developed Savannah Poorhouse and Hospital. The remarkable thing about this is that the new development managed to avoid significantly damaging this tree. The building was built around it, and there it stood. Even into the 1860s with the Civil War, the building was used both for Confederate and U.S. Hospital operations, and of course, because it's still around, the frustration of man caused no serious injury on this tree. By 1931, the building was newly christened and purchased by the Warren A. Candler Hospital, which gave its name to the tree. The hospital and the old oak then grew iconic together. Both named, they grew. And like Shel Silverstein's giving tree, the Candler Oak yielded more and more of its soil to the hospital as it needed. The hospital soon covered a large portion of the land surrounding the tree with tarmac to support an automobile parking lot. By the 1960s, one could reasonably shield their car from the sun's rays by parking underneath the tree's branches. Now this is very unique, right? There's a decision being made in this. The Candler Oak could have very easily been destroyed, very easily removed. The city really had adopted strict codes about early trees, where you can plant them, when you can take them down, but none of these applied to the Candler Oak because it was on private property. So the Candler Hospital could have removed the tree and gained about 14 parking spots, but it didn't, and that's unique, right? In the choice to not take down the Candler tree, the hospital said this tree belongs to be here. It gets to be here, we'll work around it. And in that first initial choice, they started to create the Candler Oak as a special tree. It's something that deserves to exist despite the need for more parking spots. And that's a really significant relationship to begin to build. So though old, the Candler Oak was never truly alone. So though special and though old, sat in a parking lot. It was never alone. There were always other trees around that the Candler Oak saw come and go. Thousands upon thousands of trees have lived their lives, had their lives cut short, while the Candler Oak has maintained. And Savannah, for most of its history, has been very well treed. The original trustees' garden included mulberry, olive, orange, apple, and pear trees. Now the date that Savannah, the city, the municipality, began to formally plant trees is a little bit of a mystery. There's some conflicting evidence existing out there. Now, historian Henry Lawrence says that Savannah planted 2 lines of trees along Bay Street before 1800. It's pretty early. Author John Lambert noted that in 1808, each of the squares had a small plantation of trees, a little cluster. Now, we fast forward a bit, by 1810, the trees had been planted in the squares and had white cedar posts and chain rope fences around it. So somebody was caring, somebody was planting, someone was making them a little special. After the turn of the century, the trees were likewise planted on East and West Broad Street that kind of framed the city. And then inside the city, trees lined the sidewalks. Around the same time, the squares were formalized, given more denser gardens and what kind of little fences? They got little chain garden gates this time. Now, when Revolutionary era hero the Marquis de Lafayette visited the town in 1825, his man found the streets to be planted on each side with a row of delightful trees. As you can kind of pick up here, when people talk about Savannah, they often talk about the trees as well. Depictions of the city in 1837 feature plenty of trees on all sides of the buildings and framing major roads. 1851, an English visitor wrote that nearly every row of houses was shaded by a row of olive and orange trees, which were interspersed with oaks and poplar. This image here is from 1883. As you can see, it includes lots of little trees. Now, the modern city of Savannah claims that the city began its formal tree planting efforts in 1891, but the news reports kind of suggest that it happened a little bit before. What we can be sure of is that the late 1800s is when Savannah really became invested in the trees. We also know from early city ordinances that people were very concerned about the trees. There were ways you could treat the trees and ways you could not treat the trees. These ordinances outlined that people were not to remove or damage the trees. Digging up, cutting down, or injuring the trees in any manner would result in a fine or imprisonment. The city also, this is pretty intense, right? The city also included specific spacing laws for planting the trees. that depended on the width of the street. Trees could be between 20 to 26 feet apart. Failure to abide by these ordinances could result in a fine, and not prison time, but removal of the sapling. So there's a concern here, right? There are laws about the trees. There's really, really strong penalties for messing with the trees. And it's within this context we see the emergence of the late 1800s, specifically the year 1881. This is an important shift in the trees. So oftentimes people who are walking around Savannah assume that the trees are just as old as the squares. Not the case. 1881 kind of marks our first nearly cutting of the trees. So by that date, in 1881, the urban arbors were the pride of the city, something people talked about that was a big deal. They were numerous enough to both provide appreciated shade from the hot summer months, and they also were a great concern during hurricane season. Now, when a terrific tempest tore through the city in August 1881, the trees took center stage. For 2 days, wind and rain blew through the coastal city with such violence that dead tree limbs, building facades, and roofs were carried off down the streets. After the storm abated, Savannians awoke to find their city was strewn with branches and leaves and chinaberries. Fallen trees had made the roads impassable by both carriage or foot. And these trees had snapped down new telegraph lines. Homes were completely demolished from the storm, and business owners went to their buildings to find that their roofs were completely gone and all of their store stock was soaked. The damage seemed endless, but it was the destruction of the shade trees, one author wrote in all caps, that was simply appalling. 5 years later, in 1886, the city had not recovered its trees, leaving one resident to declare in the paper that the city's era of trees was over. Savannah was no longer a tree city. In 1896, the city of Savannah, seeing that they still hadn't populated trees back to where they were before the storm, created the Park and Tree Commission to take charge of caring for all of the city's parks, its lovely cemeteries, and its trees on streets and within the parks and squares. The first thing this group did was they planted a double row of palmetto and crepe myrtle on Oglethorpe and Abercorn Avenues. Farther south on Oglethorpe, they planted live oak trees on what they hoped would become the handsomest and most admired streets in the city. The squares at the time were all given a plowing and a grading, new grass and trees. The larger parks throughout the city received similar treatment, plus benches and other fencing. When finished, the city's pre-existing 11,000 trees had doubled to around 22,000. In comes Daffin. From fall of 1899 to August 1900, the Park and Tree Commission, under the leadership of Philip Daffin, who Daffin Park is named after, had planted over 1,000 young trees that the residents of Savannah were monitoring with great interest. Like nervous new mothers, they would write into the newspaper about the probability of their tree dying, or looking at their tree and thinking it might be dying, or what new chemical combination they have concocted that they think that if applied to the trees would guarantee that they would grow strong and live forever. The people of Savannah were concerned about their new trees and desperately wanted the city to continue to be treed and to make up for the loss from the storm. Now, the people seemed deeply concerned and energized about the trees, but the city council was less so. There was a great bitterness between Daffin and the city council. In 1910, he refused to submit a budget, citing that the council's repeated slashing of his budget made the very idea of writing one seem like a folly. He felt, and he told the newspapers, he felt that they were willingly ignoring one of the most important branches of the city government, the Park and Tree Commission. Daffin suspected that the city council would gladly get rid of the Park and Tree Commission, but the very act would be political suicide, as most citizens supported his commission's work. From Daffin's vantage, the councilmen were jealous of the citizens' patronage to the Park and Tree Commission and generally feared anyone who had the best interests of the city at heart. Now, the popularity of the trees and the growing of the trees and the growing popularity in town led him to believe that as the keeper of the urban forest, he wielded great power in Savannah. But time after time, city council denied his budget requests. When pressed again for a new budget in December, Daffin requested a stunning $20,850. That was $5,000 more than the year prior. The council shot back with $8,000. And in 1903, the commission requested a much more generous 13,000. So there's plenty of local politics wrapped up into the trees in the cities. But the issues, of course, were not simply about budget. One of the major fights that the city has from time to time, and will from this time period forward, is the level of respect that were given to the trees and to the Park and Tree Commission. One story in particular with Daffin takes place on Bull Street. In 1903, there was this big controversy because the council had approved the removal of a building and had not consulted Daffin about the tree that also needed to be trimmed. Daffin, of course, noted this and was very angry. So instead of the city contacting him, the contractor who was tasked with moving the building reached out to Duffin and said, "What do we do? What can we do with this tree? Should we take it down? Can I trim it?" Of course. And it's my phone,
Yeah.
isn't it? That's fine. Lovely. So the contractor goes to Daffin. He says, we have this tree. What should we do with it? You're the tree guy, right? You are Savannah's Lorax, though they wouldn't know that reference. And Daffin says, whatever, just cut it. He is mad, he is bitter, because the city didn't ask him at all. The city did not come and consult him about the potential loss of this tree. So Daffin said, do whatever you want, you're gonna do whatever you want anyway. He's a very sassy historical person. I always love those kind of documents. Once the people saw what had happened to the tree, this now limbless tree, they were aghast. One resident commented that having now seen the tree, they felt that cutting off the limbs of that old tree was a greater loss than the value of the home that had been removed. This hurt, right? And we'll see this many times throughout Savannah's history, is that the people of Savannah have a big heart for the trees. Maybe not so much in protecting them being knocked down, but when they're knocked down, a part of the city's heart is lost. Now, as you can imagine, Daffin's going to remain a very firm character for the tenure in his Park and Tree Commission. But the trees, however, are not going to take up as much space in the minds of Savannians as they did in his by the time World War I started. That is going to hold much more pressing news and much more pressing concerns than the city's trees. By 1918, the Park and Tree Commission was suffering even more from the lack of funds and, due to the war, a lack of labor. While the team was still able to plant some 124 trees, the maintenance of the trees that were already planted proved a nearly impossible task. The trimming, the taking down of old trees, things like that. Daffin wrote in 1918 that 289 trees needed to be replanted, 62 needed to be removed, and trimming the trees was simply impossible because of a shortage of climbers who could climb up and do it. The only relief that he noted was that the trees were not in danger from insect agencies or fungus troubles, and the fertilization treatments in the squares were working well. But by and large, he felt like he simply could not keep up with what was demanded. So already on their heels, the 1920s brought the trees a new and more dangerous enemy. First, the people of Savannah seemed indifferent. The love that they had for the trees seemed to wane in the war years. When once they worried over the arbors like mothers, they now simply seemed to not care. They were distracted. The Park and Tree Commission noted that while they had planted over 600 trees in 1923, most of them had died. And they laid the blame on the people of Savannah. They said that the people didn't consider the trees, didn't care for the trees, didn't value them. They drove their cars into them, bumped them with their bumpers, pushed on them too hard, leaned on them too often, and demanded too much of their newly formed limbs. One of the biggest tasks the commission faced now was trimming the trees to make way for the cars. Giving in, essentially, that the cars had more power and right in the city than the trees. They were called improvements. And really, it was cutting them in a way so that you could be in your car and see around the tree to get to an intersection, which is something we still struggle with today. The first decades of the 20th century, the Park and Tree Commission's main goal was to make the city beautiful. After the 1920s, its main goal was trimming the city forest to better fit the needs of automobiles. And cars are really needy machines. And old Savannah was not fit for them and couldn't really give them what they needed. To drive a car, one needs roads. To drive one decent, one needs hard, flat roads. To park a car, one needs space on the road and preferably one nearest to your destination. Without definitive allotted rooms, cars began to conquer spaces across the nation. People drove cars right up to the water on beaches and deep into the forest for camping. They parked on sidewalks, they parked in lawns, they parked in parks. Motorists argued that to contain these cars, cities needed to provide them with places to go. And so cities across the United States took down their trees and paved their streets with hard, sort of suffocating, root-suffocating concretes. And this to suit the needs of car drivers and automotive shoppers. These new special roads were developed where people could drive very fast and horses were not allowed. So we're at this moment in time, early 20th century, we're seeing a retrofitting of American cities towards automobiles. And those eras of celebrating trees are beginning to disappear, even in Savannah, a very well-treed city. At the beginning, even more so, at the beginning of the 1920s, there were 25 garden squares in Savannah, each with a collection of shrubbery, grasses, or trees. And by 1936, there were 22. A story we all know. But how does a city lose 3 squares? They paved them for I-16. And in the age of the automobile parks, trees, and green spaces, always take a back seat to the smooth, broad roadways where motorists could speed past beautiful architecture and city life. The removal of the trees and squares to make way for cars set a worrisome precedent, but did really very little to the city's overall tree population. Good on them, they had plenty of trees left. The city removed a total of 146 trees by 1936, but there were still plenty of trees left. By 1937, the city maintained 25,000 trees, not counting those in cemeteries, and added 43 more in that year. The city was filled with trees, and the Park and Tree Commission was taking diligent care of them, and at that time in the 1930s, enjoyed a robust labor force brought to them by those New Deal era workforces. By the end of the decade, the city was confident that cars were not going to pose a problem to them anymore. But in the large scheme of things, a significant decline of trees wasn't really in the foreseeable future. Then the future happened in 1940, when the tree's age-old nemesis, weather, shuffled the deck in Savannah once again. In August 1940, on the 11th and 12th, a hurricane ravaged our shore. It landed in South Carolina and did great damage there, but Savannah suffered high winds. Similar to that 1881 storm, this one sent roofs flying and littered the streets with downed trees. The Park and Tree Commissioner was devastated. Seeing the damage, papers reported that Daffin was seen on the verge of weeping at the sight of all these downed trees. And it was really for good reason that Daffin and the other people of Savannah were on the verge of tears, because the city had suffered around $4 million in damage. And Daffin knew, after all the fights he had had with city council, that they were certainly not going to give him the budget he needed to bring the trees back where they once were. And quickly on the heels of this disaster, World War II came, and the Park and Tree Commission did what it could with its limited funds and labor. At the same time, the population of the city boomed during the war years, as did many coastal cities. People were busy with the work of war and weren't really concerned with the trees, or really the downtown for that matter. The new and old populations during the war and after filtered through the old parts of the city and settled in the south, into new suburban areas, leaving the city's core to slumlords and largely to abandon. This practice, of course, continued after the war, and in many other cities in the United States. Savannah carried on its new building in the suburbs, outside of the city center, and they funneled a lot of the wealth out of the downtown. It is at this time that Savannah lost about 31% of its urban population, which all seems dire, but if you're thinking about the trees, this is great. All of this creates a situation where the trees that are downtown are really unbothered. At this point in history, a lot of Savannah's roads were unpaved still, and so the trees kind of grew and grew and grew without being knocked down by or bumped by new developments or really that much traffic or hard-covered roads. In the 1950s and 1960s, when many of these cities again were removing their trees, Savannah was largely kind of staying still, and her trees were growing knobby and wild. The issues, of course, began to emerge once again when the city began shedding old buildings. The Wetter House, famously first with its stunning intricate iron railings that wrapped around the first and second floor balconies, was torn down to make room for a used car lot. And various groups in the city tried to save the building. They asked the city for money. They asked residents for money, but to no avail. It was simply too expensive to save. City Market, where the city had gone to trade since the 18th century, was demolished for a multi-level parking lot. And next, as the wrecking ball seemed set for the Davenport House, the home of a wealthy 18th century builder, a group calling themselves the Historic Savannah Foundation blocked the demolition. Like hundreds of preservation groups before them, like Mount Vernon Ladies Association, they pooled their money and collected funds to purchase the home, and they began to restore the building. From their new offices in the Davenport House, the group created a revolving fund that furnished restoration projects with the capital they needed to rehab homes and some apartment blocks as well. By the 1970s, the foundation had not only saved the Davenport House, but the Mary Marshall row of houses, the Troop Trust townhomes, the Oliver Sturgis Mansion, numerous buildings in the Victorian District on West Congress Street, the Shopping Street Broughton, homes in Pulaski Square, the recently abandoned old campus buildings of the Armstrong Junior Campus along Bull Street, and a $1 million restoration to the 1818 William Scarborough House. On top of creating sort of a visual architectural beauty or restoring it in Savannah, their work established and insisted that the visual past, the view of yesterday, mattered in Savannah and should be protected in the city. But what about the trees? So while the Historic Savannah Foundation was focusing on architecture, a new group had their eyes aimed on the city's trees. It's 1974, and Lydia Beam, Paige Hungerpiller, and Susie Williams began reviewing tree ordinances from surrounding states, hoping to write a policy for Savannah. In 1976, they brought their proposal to the city and the county. In their proposal, Beam argued that the proposal was similar to what most places in Florida had and would not require any extra monetary expenditures by the city or the county. Simply, the ordinance would create the Chatham County Tree Commission, made up of 5 representative groups: the Georgia Conservancies, the Chatham Confederation of Garden Clubs, the Savannah Area Chamber of Commerce, Historic Savannah Foundation, and the Home Builders Association of Chatham County. They said that this new group would have final say on the removal and planting of trees. They would have the power to prosecute tree offenders and the ability to collect and distribute funds to educate the public on the economic and aesthetic beauty of trees. Paige Hungerpiller further explained that it was really the out-of-town developers who built unattractive developments without regard for the landscape that made this ordinance necessary. The group as a whole felt that the commercial establishments owed it to the community to make their establishments attractive by planting trees. But it was Lydia Beam who connected the trees to history. She said that Savannah was terribly unique and needed to be protected. The ordinance, she said, would bring about an awareness of the value of trees and an understanding that the trees were a part of Savannah's heritage. Residents, she argued, are fond of history and therefore ought to be particularly aware of tree protection. Now, out of their proposal, a kind of policy passed, granting the Park and Tree Commission more powers, but more tree-related issues began to emerge, and the commission really fell short. As one writer put it, the seed had grown but had not gotten big enough to bear fruit. Throughout the 1970s, the city of Savannah was actively endeavoring to transition many of its urban dirt roads to paved streets, again, so you could drive through it a lot easier. The modern hard surface roads required more room and butted up to the ground that the trees had been planted in some 100 years prior. The dirt roads worked well for the trees, the dirt roads worked well for the trees, but the paved roads threatened to choke the trees, making them weak and transforming them ultimately into road hazards. At the opening of the 1980s, Savannah restoration efforts had brought millions of dollars into the city and led to the development of this really massive tourism industry, which brought in $71 million to local business. Savannah moved past its little slump from the war years, avoided the destruction of urban renewal craze, and emerged into the last decade of the 20th century, a really powerhouse destination, hosting around 50 million guests annually. Though most of the accolades for the city's restoration and preservation are focused on the homes and the businesses, the architecture, the squares, the city's trees were as much a part of the city's historical feel that brought people in as the brick sidewalks. But they weren't treated as such. It's still an uphill battle for the trees. Pavement continued to be a nemesis of the city's trees. And the decade opened with a drought, making the tree's existence in the city even worse. Savannah had received under 13 inches of rain that year. The result was dead and wilted trees all over town, weak trees that couldn't stay in the soil. Magnolias, dogwoods, and oaks of varying ages lost their leaves that summer as well. There was a blight that made the tree limbs look like they had been burning off. Unfortunately, as Albert Scardino in the Georgia Gazette pointed out, the city's residents had long taken the trees for granted. Many noticed the trees suffering in the summer of 1980, but he argued that things as simple as the weather change and holiday activities drew their attention away from the trees that were dying around them. Despite the fact that the trees had provided important buffer from noises, heat, and wind, and, he argued, defined the city's character as much as the old houses and St. Patrick's Day, only a few residents were really paying attention to the trees. No concern, Scardino wrote, had been shown about the disease on the trees and how it affected humans. He challenged the Park and Tree Commission's leader, Marmon Thomas, to show a little life. Marmon Thomas did. He started an effort as a sweeping reevaluation of the trees. The main aim was to find and remove the trees that had become a liability, those that would fall, knock down power lines, hurt cars and people. When the project kicked off, there were around 500 trees that were set for removal. In total, among the 42,000 trees, 2,900 were deemed a hazard and needed to be destroyed. He also wanted to plant new trees. If he was taking away trees, he realized he needed to put new stuff in, and a new kind of tree that was better suited for city life. But the Savannah Park and Tree Commission only had a 15-person team caring for some 70,000 trees. Other cities with similar tree numbers had around 40 people. Most days, the Savannah teams were busy doing emergency removals, and replanting was really low on the list. They put forth an idea to have tree maintenance contracted out and have the Park and Tree Commission in charge of planting, but the cost was too tremendous. It was not something the city was willing to pay for. So it was in this context, this sort of difficult time for the trees, that Paige Hungerpiller, Susan Williams, and Lydia Beam joined together again to protect the trees, this time specifically in their Riverside neighborhood. Like many of the old roads in the city's urban area, the plans to widen White Bluff Road threatened the rows of thick old trees that had framed it. The group talked with the Georgia Department of Transportation and got them to agree to create a tree-lined median with their expansion project. Enthused by this early win, the women formalized themselves into the Savannah Tree Foundation and sought to apply their skills more widely in the city. It's not long after the Savannah Tree Foundation was created, Thomas was replaced in the Park and Tree Commission by the aptly named Don Gardner. As a leader of the commission, he took center stage when Beam, Hungerpiller, and Williams' old proposal came back up. Gardner argued that if the people of Savannah wanted to keep the city's trees, they needed to start treating them like ladies, giving them the respect that they deserved. Gardner went on to explain that most of the trees were between 100 and 110 years old and needed special attention or were going to continue to be susceptible to issues. He recognized that the trees were one of Savannah's most valuable resources and were partially responsible for the city's tourism industry. Gardner had hoped that if he could catalog each of the trees and assign them, each of the trees, think about how many trees are in the city, each of the trees, and assign them a monetary value, he could then open the city's coffers to get them to realize how valuable the trees are. Top on his list, he wrote the Candler Oak, and he said it was worth $65,000. Now there's a good reason why Gardner included the Candler Oak, though it's not a city tree. The Candler Oak and the property it grew on had just been sold by the Candler Hospital to a group called Huntington II Limited. It was an absentee landlord named William E. Hamby of Atlanta. When founding the Savannah Tree Foundation in 1983, Hungerpiller, Williams, and Beam had no plans to take care of or own the Candler Oak at all. It was just a tree that they had on their list of concerns that they should look into. It was at one of their first meetings that Beam suggested that their new group take it upon themselves to assist William Hamby, the new owner, in the care of the tree. She explained that the Savannah Tree Foundation could provide him with expert advice on how to relieve the tree's root system from that paved parking area. But when Hungerpiller reached out to the owner, William Hamby, his son eagerly expressed his approval of the project and explained that him and his father had no plan to jeopardize the tree and were willing to donate it to the Savannah Tree Foundation with an easement around it for the purpose of continued maintenance. This was an alarming letter to get because they really thought they were going to have to fight this one. And he said, no, that sounds great. But then it went silent, radio silence. The Savannah Tree Foundation was energized by Haney's letter and quickly went to work. They hired a tree doctor, Dr. Thomas Perry, to come and evaluate the Candler oak. And the doctor had a really hopeful yet damning prognosis. He said the tree was in really bad shape, but if they could move fast, they could protect it, they could save it. So Hunger Pillar sent this report to Haney in the fall of 1983 and spent 2 months waiting, and then sent another letter in December, and then waited again and sent another in the spring. It was getting very tense because the doctor said, if you do it now, the tree can be saved. If you do it later, it won't be. And the silence continued. After a long silence, the Haneys offered up a more formal easement of a 20-foot radius around the arbor for the protection of the tree. They offered this in May 1984. In December 1984, the Savannah Tree Foundation became the tree's official stewards. It's not that dramatic of a story. But though little was reported about this process, because there's not much juice to it, once the news was declared, the tree quickly became an icon in the city. Almost overnight, the tree went from large and near the park to historical and meaningful, because the Historical Savannah Foundation had created a logic by which things were saved in the city because they were historical and because they were beautiful. So when looking at the Candler oak, now preserved, now protected, many people said, well, why else would anything be saved if it wasn't historical? So the tree's new historical meaning was vague, but unmistakably present. So much so that by October of 1985, when the Savannah Tree Foundation finally had all that concrete pulled up, artifact hunters came to the tree at night and started digging holes around the roots, which is really bad for the tree, to try to find things that they thought were under there. They reasoned that the pavement maybe was laid on top of the tree to protect something mystical or valuable or important. And commercial tours have followed this line of thinking today, and really the last 20 years. Some claim that the Candler oak holds some kind of unarticulated connection to the spirits of the Civil War dead, or to those who had painful deaths in the early hospitals. It's popular today to use the Candler oak as a spot to talk about the history of lynching in Georgia, though none of the typical records of such violence are connected to that particular tree. I've also heard ghost hunters say that the Candler oak marks the entrance to the spiritual realm and is the main reason why Savannah retains so many ghosts. And the story of the tree's rescue also became a bit more dramatic. In 1987, an article in Dixie Living wove a story about a greedy big city developer who wanted to come cut the Candler oak down and pave it over for a measly 14 more parking spots. Paige Hungerpiller explained that she told the Haneys, we don't do those things in Savannah. Unlike in Savannah, where Haney was from, beauty, she said, was more important than business or entertainment for Savannahans' quality of life. While certainly more lore than fact, the story helped to bring a sense of local distinction and a little bit of heroism to the city's ongoing tree battles. It made fighting for the trees something Savannah people do, and further, something they do to preserve the past in the city. And it wasn't all just stories and lore. The Savannah Tree Foundation's success really helped bolster Gardner's plans for the Park and Tree Commission. With a newly tested, powerful lobby of wealthy locals behind him, Gardner created a new tree planting and management program that sought to go beyond crisis management and towards a celebration of the city's relationship with trees. Going along with the narrative set by Hungerpiller in the magazine, Gardner quipped, where else but Savannah would you find a big live oak tree standing amid the pavement of a major intersection? Now, these assertions about the Candler oak have greatly affected how people relate to the city's other trees. The presence of this very old, mysterious, kind of silent tree safely guarded behind a little special fence has created a sense that the trees in Savannah are just nearly as old as the Candler oak, or at least as old as the squares. But the vast majority of the trees in the city are not. Most were planted in the 20th century. They're as old as you or I. They are nearly at the end of their lifespan, some of them, and none will get or are as old as the Candler oak. The closest tree in age and proximity was the Drayton oak, and it was removed by SCAD, unfortunately, on Earth Day in 2019, when they needed to pave more parking lot at the old Candler Hospital. But in the long scheme of things, the city's trees are not all that historical in the way that we have defined historical trees in the past. But it's historical in a very Savannah sense. Their presence, despite automobile intrusion, grants the city a uniquely historical landscape that complements the old architecture and illustrates a different way of living, a different way of evaluating trees, a different way of evaluating and understand what historical landscape is, and one that you really will have a hard time finding outside of Savannah. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Pirok?
Yes.
Is it true that, I know there's trees on Broughton Street now because in the last 20 years they were planted, but were there never trees on Broughton Street?
I don't know if there were never trees on Broad Street. I know that they planted a lot of new ones after they redid the road, but I'm trying to think back of pictures of Broad Street. That's where I would go to find out, to see the municipal archives, to see if trees are depicted in there.
Do you live there?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm just asking because it's hard to remember the years, but within the last 20 years, there really haven't been that many trees on Broad Street. And then that developer from Atlanta came in and made all of those, I don't know what you call it, things to put trees in to be decorative. Now, some of those are still there, but some of them were taken away. So I'm just interested, was there a reason not to have trees on Broad Street?
There have been several different planting and cycles of Broad Street trees over many years. So we've had different generations of plantings and trees on Broughton Street. You know, if you look at pictures of Broughton Street through the decades, you'll see trees, but you'll see different types of trees at different eras in our history.
And that's a whole nother story of Savannah's trees too, is sort of how, what trees were decided to be planted. And many of them, after the storms, were picked for their sturdiness in the 20s. A lot of the trees that dropped those horrible gumballs, those were picked because they were really affordable. If you live in that part of Savannah with the gumballs.
Yeah, if you go back and look at like annual reports, you'll see that sort of decision-making process, where let's say, oh, we're planning this on the street for this reason, and this is how much we're spending. So there's a lot of decision-making, thought process that goes in at a specific point in time for different reasons.
Which I think is one of the great things about the trees in Savannah, is that the reality of them is a real challenge to the way that we understand them as being sort of timeless creatures in our environment, when in fact they're very thoughtful. Like, we put a lot of thought into where we're planting trees, what kind of trees we're planting, how are we planting them, what's going to bother them with how much people walk through the area or drive through the area. Makes them really much more of an extension of our human selves than an extension of the wild earth, which is really fascinating.
And sometimes it's what's popular at the time.
So like, just to give you on Broad Street, in about the 80s or 90s when they renovated Broughton Street, they put in holly trees. The intent obviously was that it would block signage, but it would create a landscape along the street. When they redid those eventually they were in like 4x4 wells that had walls, so it was kind of like a little planter box underground on those. They went through a whole public engagement process, and the public wanted canopy there because they wanted to be able to walk the street and enjoy the shade, which brought in the elm trees, the Chinese elms that were there prior to the recent replanting and renovation of it, which remains left some of the elms, then planted a couple other species. Again, now trying to go back to a walkable community, because before the hollies there were no trees at the time. You could see all the signage, you had all the lighting, you had all the big, shop billboards and the cars driving by. But there's a turn to get back to a walkable outdoor space. So people wanted the shade and not the visibility of the signage.
So I'm on the Park and Street Commission, and we don't have a budget. We were talking about when did the Park and Street Commission, did the Park and Street Commission become the Park and Street Department at some point, or?
What, 1956 was the change?
So there's a Yeah, I wanted to mention that. So the Park and Tree Commission is an advisory body to the Park and Tree Department, of which Gordon is the director. So it's two distinct sort of bodies that work together. Originally, it was just the Park and Tree Commission. And I think
And
the
they had a
fifties.
superintendent.
Yeah, they had a
They had a
superintendent.
superintendent, and then in the fifties, when they moved to the mayor manager government.
Council
Council
manager
manager
government.
government, yeah. They created a department, and kept the commission as an advisory board to them, and the superintendent became the superintendent, and then eventually the director position.
Yeah, so the
Yeah.
department
So we got
does the
divided
physical
in.
work.
Yeah, we don't have to-
We're still fighting.
Oh, I saw your hand, then I said.
Okay, sorry. I was just curious if you looked into any of the trees on Victory Drive, because I'm over all the visitor information centers, and we've tried to steer people kind of out to that area just for what those trees represent, all of our fallen soldiers, and did you research them at all?
Not in particular, my look was more broad of trying to see really what the people of Savannah thought about and felt about the trees.
Okay.
So they're creating that human-tree relationship, because really, what a lot of my research deals with is interpretation and lore. So a part of that, I think, is sort of how people are making meaning from trees. So I don't have the exact data, but I'm pretty positive
Yeah.
archives would definitely have that. And I
I
really
can write it
encourage
for
you
you.
to look at that stuff, because it's great.
I do know that on the, you might, it's like remembering Tybee, like how Tybee once was, there's a bunch of pictures of Victory Drive and what it used to look like and how Tybee used to look like with all the trees and how much it's changed, so I can send you things.
Is it thanks to the trees that we don't have double-decker tour buses?
Ooh. Maybe, yeah.
Good fight for them.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, SCAD had double-decker student buses
Yeah.
in the nineties, so.
Probably, like, if,
Yeah.
I would imagine people don't wanna get bonked on the head with the trees.
That's a very good question.
But no, yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other roadways that perhaps that. Or people didn't want tourists being able to look at their ground floor windows and their second floor windows. You just want one part of the house clean, upstairs everyone can see it.
So this might be somewhat speculative, but given your interest in memory, and why do you think that trees occupy such a mystical place in our consciousness?
I think it's because we see trees and we don't understand them. So a lot, like with the exception of a few of you in this room, I don't think most of us could look at a tree and tell us what kind it is or even how old it is. So because we know trees exist, but we don't clock them in the same way we do humans, and they don't age like humans, we don't know how to read trees at all. We just like them. So we have this very strained relationship where we both like and appreciate and ignore and don't understand them. So out of this sort of desire for trees and a lack of knowledge, that is the warm spot where lore and stories come out of, because you just don't know. So you're like, I bet you the reason why they covered this area in concrete is because there's something magical underneath this tree. Because they just don't know. Like there's a general idea this is a very old tree, but why, and of course we apply our logic to stuff of like, why on earth would you choke a tree out with concrete? There must be something good down there. So I think it's because we just don't know a lot about trees.
Did I hear you say, like, it was like 1818 or whatever, when they started doing some of the first plantings, that they included crepe myrtles?
Oh, let me check. So it would have been after,
Yeah, those were added with great rose and palms.
China berries were actually the first, I think, on Bay Street.
That's 150 years earlier than I thought it was going to be. That's surprising.
Just see double road China berries.
cedar posts. Palm trees. Double row, okay.
They're really elegant when they're long.
Insert. All right. All right, so it's 1896. They planted a double row of palmetto and crepe myrtle on Oglethorpe and Abercorn. that's from, I'm looking at my footnotes. That's the Park and Tree Commission, box 1, folder 11. Too much, but it's, yeah, that's the 18. Yep.
I think we have one more, time for one more question.
Well, I don't want to ask a question, I just want to share something with you.
Okay.
In the 1960s, I was a Red Cross volunteer, what they called a penny striper, or,
Yeah.
when you went through the hospital.
Candy stripe?
Yeah, candy, with a candy card and juice and things like that. And I can't tell you the number of nurses who told me that the reason that oak tree was spared and preserved was because it was healthy for the patients to be able to see it.
Ah, that makes sense. That's one
I've
of the
never,
reasons.
I've never seen that written anywhere, but that's what they told me, that the reason that tree was spared and protected was because it was good for the patients to be able to see it once they could get out of bed.
In the early justification for the first of the Savannah Poorhouse and Hospital, one of the reasons why they said that they built it out there for them was that the trees were good for people to see, like in that forested area. So that's, logically, that's probably it. But that's not a
And
sign.
the other thing I was gonna share with you, that Rita Elliott is a well-known archaeologist in this area. She and her husband have an archaeological business. And they had some funds to research a site out where they built the extension of 204. There was an area out there. And they did a couple of digs that were close to big trees on that property, and they did find things.
Oh, yeah, no, there is.
So they, you know,
There's
they
stuff.
purposely went close to where the trees were, the big trees.
Because the trees, so don't go digging stuff if you're not an archaeologist.
But you don't know what you're doing,
Yeah,
don't do it.
don't do that, because you might disrupt the tree roots and then it'll crush you. And it's bad for archaeology, but yeah, because of the way trees grow, when you have your layers of stuff and all that, the tree's roots will push stuff up and it'll collect something. So if a professional comes to your house and removes a tree, and they turn up all that soil, go looking through that. Like, you definitely might find something, but I don't want to encourage anybody to dig at root trees, or the roots of trees. It's dangerous.
I think that's a good note.
Be safe.
Trees are healthy, don't mess with their roots. I want to thank you very much for
Thank you
coming and
for having
speaking with us today. Let's give her another round of applause.